Good evening. My name is Nicole Quadra, and I want to welcome you to our event tonight um, with photographer Dick Evans and journalist Kathy Chin Leong, who are going to share their work on their collaborative exploration of San Francisco's Chinatown, highlighting this historic neighborhood dating to the gold rush to the 1850s, its history, celebrations, and residents with informative stories, interviews, and striking photography. Um, I am going to introduce our two speakers tonight, but first a little bit of housekeeping. Our program will go for 1 hour, roughly, so we plan to end around 7 p.m. There will be time at 6:45 for your questions. In order to ask your questions, we ask that you use the Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen. That's a great place for us to see your questions. It kind of organizes your questions. But there's also a chat feature also at the bottom of your screen, and you are welcome to use that feature as well, just to comment or maybe share insights or stories of your own. So please use the chat and use the Q&A for questions. I want to tell you also that all proceeds from book sales go to the Chinese Culture Center and to Heyday Books in Berkeley, which is a not-for-profit publisher. We're going to put a link in the chat to that you can use for if you want to purchase a book, but 3 lucky people will win a free copy of the book. So we're going to take our registration information from tonight, and we're going to pull 3 of you out of a virtual hat, and you'll hear from us via email, and then make arrangements to pick up your copy of San Francisco's Chinatown. Okay, so about Dick Evans, the photographer. Dick Evans is a San Francisco-based photographer with an interest in documenting the colorful and rapidly changing neighborhoods of the city. Born into a ranching family in Eugene, Oregon, he graduated as an engineer from Oregon State University and subsequently obtained a master's degree in management from Stanford. He has spent his 50-year career in the global metals sector, living in 5 countries and multiple locations in Africa, Europe, and North America. It was during these travels that he developed an appreciation for the diversity and richness of different cultures, both global and local, and an interest in documentary photography. And I just want to say that I met Dick when his book, The Mission, came out. That was first programming with Dick. He came to our libraries, in our in-person libraries, back in, I think it was 2018. And that was a beautiful book. I would recommend that if you're interested in photography and interested in the city, that you check it out. We have it in our library. It documents the murals of the Mission District in San Francisco. Kathy Chin Leong, the writer. Kathy Chin Leong, an award-winning journalist, covers travel, technology, business, art, and architecture, and anything that piques her interest. Her writing has been published in the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, National Geographic Books, Sunset Magazine, and other nationally recognized publications. Growing up in a bicultural environment, Chinese at home and American at school, she is typical of many ABCs who struggle with identity issues and eventually learn to embrace their Chinese heritage. While she has traveled the globe from the Middle East to Europe to Asia, she rediscovered her Chinatown roots through collaboration on this book, which has been the journey of a lifetime. She lives in Sunnyvale, California. So before I hand it over to Dick and Kathy, we actually have a quick little film to show you. It's a 3-minute book trailer, and take it away. Thank you. So I'm not sure who is going to start. Is it Kathy or Dick?
It's Dick. I'll start.
Okay.
Okay. Thanks very much, Nicole. And thanks to you and your colleagues for organizing and hosting this event. And thank you to the San Mateo County Library for sponsoring us. As you mentioned, I did make did give a couple of book talks for the mission book, and I have very fond memories of going to Half Moon Bay and to Atherton and to Foster City.
Yeah.
And I'm sure there was another branch library or two that we did it at, and very much enjoyed that. So it was natural to want to come back 3 years later with the Chinatown book. So now that you've seen the trailer, gives you a little taste, Kathy and I would like to go into a little more detail, some of the photos that we like, some of the stories that go with it. And then, of course, always encouraging your comments in the chat room and your questions that we'll try to get to before we wrap up tonight. So the first image that you see here is one that if you live in the Bay Area and have visited Chinatown, will look rather familiar to you. This is Grant Avenue, which is the heart of Chinatown. Grant Avenue runs right through Chinatown, north to south. It also happens to be one of the oldest, if not the oldest, streets in San Francisco. It was previously known as DuPont Avenue, but then when Chinatown was rebuilt, which I'll get to in a minute, after the earthquake, they decided to change the name because DuPont Avenue had a reputation for not being a very pleasant place with drugs, prostitution, all kinds of issues about it. So they changed the name, rebranded as Grant Avenue, and it has been that ever since. But the architecture and the red lanterns that you see here, of course, are very typical of what we think of as being Chinatown. And certainly from when I first visited, probably in the 1970s, that's what I always thought. And I had just assumed that when the Chinese came in 1800, they brought their architecture with them. And that's how we have these buildings that have this Chinese style architecture. In a minute, I'll comment on how that's not the case. We selected one image from Grant Avenue to be the front cover of the book. because we think it's so representative and people identify it as such an iconic image. This is one of the better known buildings. It used to house the Four Seas restaurant, a very iconic, well-known restaurant. The restaurant's been closed for a number of years, but the sign is actually still outside if you go by there. But inside now is one of the new contemporary restaurants, Mr. Jew's, which is the only Michelin-starred restaurant in Chinatown, and an excellent place to have a meal. Other typical images that you see along Grant Avenue are the historic street lamps, many of which have been refurbished and repaired, and then also the pagoda rooftops, which look, very much make you feel like you're in the Chinese mainland somewhere. Now, as I mentioned, most of us think of this as being the historic Chinatown, but the original Chinatown, starting in the 1850s, was really more of a shanty town. Had none of this architecture. It was low-rise, probably low rent, unsanitary, crowded building conditions, really virtually a ghetto at that time. But what really changed that, as I alluded to, was the 1906 earthquake. And I know most of you are probably from the Bay Area and certainly know that the 1906 earthquake leveled large parts of San Francisco, particularly downtown, and then numerous fires started, which then burned down much of the remaining city. So Chinatown, being right in the center of downtown, was affected that way, and was virtually eliminated and turned into rubble. So after the earthquake, there was a move on the part of San Francisco's city leaders to want to move the Chinese residents out to the outskirts, like out to Hunters Point or as far out as they could to the outskirts of the city, and claim that very valuable real estate right in the heart of the city, for development in their own use. Now, fortunately for us, the Chinese residents persisted and insisted on staying where they had been, but they did negotiate with the city fathers, and they agreed to reconstruct Chinatown to be both a tourist destination and to be a residential community. And the tourist destination aspect is why you see these buildings today that have lasted over 100 years now of this very quintessential Oriental style architecture, mostly built by Caucasian builders and designed by Caucasian architects with some input, it seems, from some Chinese architects. So the immigration to Chinatown, which began in the 1850s, and there was quite an influx during the gold rush, and then followed up with the railroad construction, was never an easy path. People were lured to California and San Francisco from many areas, but especially from southern China, with the promise and sometimes not the reality of vast riches and freedoms and opportunities. And yet, when many of them arrived, they found they were discriminated against. They were limited in terms of where they could live. They were limited in terms of what jobs they could perform. They had to be registered. And this discrimination continued on for essentially a whole century, through the mid 1900s. After the earthquake, those who did immigrate came through Angel Island. And Angel Island was a bit like Ellis Island in New York. It was the gateway for all immigrants coming in from the Pacific side into the United States. But the Chinese were even treated a bit differently. They were segregated. They went through separate immigration facilities. Many of them were detained for weeks and months and even longer. And while they were detained, many of them would carve their name, their initials, their story, or some saying into the wood in the buildings in which they were detained, the bare wood walls and railings. Those have all been documented a decade or so ago. Some historians documented those and then translated those. So there's actually a book that has all of the carvings done in Chinese and then translated to English. But this one in particular, which is in the Chinese Historical Society Museum in Chinatown, I think is really powerful. And in case you're looking at it with a small screen, let me just read it for you. Everybody's got a number. I think my number is 80340. They would put your number on the blackboard, and you know you have to go to interrogation or a health checkup. They did not use names. On the day they let you go, your number is on the blackboard and it says San Francisco. And if you see down below, that was carved in Chinese characters, of course, in the wood by a young man, age 11, as late as 1939. So there's quite a history of the difficult immigration and all of the traps that people were run through in order to immigrate into the United States, especially from China. Now, the first 100 years of Chinatown was filled with discrimination and difficulty and challenges. But the last 50 years, while it has opened up, there's still a very strong awareness of social justice issues, which are represented by two statues, which one is shown here. This is in the center of Portsmouth Square. It's a 10-foot tall bronze statue. And it may look familiar to you because if you remember watching the Tiananmen Square riots in 1989, you might remember seeing a statue like this 5 times taller, about 50 feet tall, in the middle of Tiananmen Square, built out of wood, cardboard, and paper that the students had erected. So this statue was built in bronze and erected in Chinatown, right in the center on Portsmouth Square, to remind people of that struggle and those issues. The second one is called the Comfort Women, and it's in St. Mary's Square in Chinatown. It's a bit more recent, and it was done as a tribute and remembrance for the young women and girls who were forced into prostitution by the Japanese army during World War II. And you see 3 girls here holding hands. One represents China, one represents Korea, and one represents the Philippines, where the young women came from that were forced into slavery. So it's interesting that those two very significant statues are right in Chinatown, in a neighborhood, in a district that knows discrimination over decades, if not centuries, and over its entire 170-year history. And we like to say as a tagline that the story of Chinatown is the story of resilience, survival, but also celebration. During the course of pulling together this book, Kathy and I worked closely together, and she interviewed over 100 people and organizations in Chinatown. So let me hand it over to Kathy to relay a couple of her stories.
Hello, everyone. This is a mural called 100 Years of Chinese in America. And as you can see on the left, it shows the Chinese immigrants that are in China. And eventually, as you move to the right, you see that they're serving in the military and have assimilated into America. This was painted by James Leong on commission. And when it was completed, the Chinese community rejected it. They did not like it because they felt that it reinforced Chinese stereotypes, even though it was historically accurate. And this hurt the feelings of the artist so much that he left America and spent the rest of his very successful art career in Europe. And later on, this mural was lost. It was later recovered by the Chinese Historical Society of America Museum and found in a rec hall, parts of it used as a ping pong table. So it was completely restored when they asked James Leong later on to come back and restore the mural. At that time, he was living in Seattle. He was semi-retired. So this was a wonderful way to circle back and honor him. Now in front of the mural is historian Sue Lee, and she's an expert in Chinese American history. And what is the significance here? You see in this slide, Chinese workers working in a shoe factory. Chinatown had become a light industrial center during the Civil War. And here, these are watercolors by the late Jake Lee, and they were a set of 12 different watercolors depicting Chinese history in Chinatown. And these works were once hanging in the elegant Khan's restaurant. And after Khan's was sold in the 1990s, these paintings mysteriously disappeared until Sue tracked them all down. And you can see many of them today in the Chinese Historical Society of America Museum when it opens up later on after COVID's over.
One of the biggest, or probably the biggest cultural event annually in Chinatown is the Lunar New Year Parade. Here you see a shot of the Lunar New Year Parade with the lion dancer in front and then the dragons behind. It's now become a destination tourism event. Very unfortunately, it will not be held this year, I understand, because of the COVID crisis. Lunar New Year is, I believe, February 12th. So very unfortunate, but it's a wonderful event, and I suspect some of you may have come to that event in the past. But today it's attended by hundreds of thousands of people, the week-long event, and then culminating in the parade on usually on the Saturday of that week. As you can see, there are many people that participate in the mile-long event and parade. Many student groups, marching bands, commercial floats, nonprofit floats, politicians, lion dancers. It's a very festive and just a feast for the eyes. And if you like photography, it's fun just to take photos of it. Now, in addition to taking photos of the parade itself, one of the best ways to get good shots, if you do go to see it, is go an hour or hour and a half early and go down to Market Street and the feeder streets into Market where the parade is assembling. And at that time, you can see all of the various bands and marching groups and floats and everybody assembling, putting on their costumes, finishing up their makeup. This photo was taken there, as was the next one that you'll see. These are two young elementary school students, as is this young woman, obviously more up in the 7th or 8th grade rather than the lower end. They are all three stilt walkers. They walk that entire over a mile parade route on stilts and in costume, as you see here. But it's a terrific place to get a lot of good photos. And as you can see here, you can get very close. You can talk with the people. You can hear their stories. You can find out about their groups. As just a very pleasant experience. Now, during Lunar New Year, of course, there's a symbol. The Lunar New Year coming up for this coming year is the ox, I believe. And the past year that we're just going through is the rat. When we were taking photos, it was the year of the pig, as you see here. So here they were giving away little plastic pigs filled with candy at one of the events associated with the parade. Now, although the Lunar New Year is the biggest cultural event, another big one, which takes place in the fall, is the Moon Festival. And here you see the moon goddess and the moon god. The moon goddess happens to be a woman named Maggie Wong, who is a journalist and a TV broadcaster who broadcasts in Chinese. And she also was one that helped Kathy and I with a number of contacts and taking us around, making introductions, making contacts that otherwise it would be very difficult to obtain.
Now, today, if Bruce Lee were still alive, he'd be 80 years old, and he is a Chinatown favorite because he was born in Chinatown in the Chinatown hospital, as was I. Now, before he came on the scene in the 1970s, Chinese males had no role models. If Chinese were depicted on television, they would be houseboys or evil emperors. If there was a lead role, it wouldn't be given to Chinese. They were given to white people who played lead Chinese roles with taped eyes, and they would speak broken English in stereotypic accents. Now, Bruce Lee changed the life of this man on the left. This is Jeff Chin. When he was a boy, he was picked on, and he was so upset he didn't like being Chinese. And one night, after a really difficult day in middle school, he sensed that the poster of Bruce Lee was reaching out to him. He felt like Bruce Lee was telling him to hang in there, everything was going to be all right. Well, that young boy grew up and he vowed to himself he would make Bruce Lee proud. He's become one of the world's top collectors of Bruce Lee memorabilia, 10,000 items, including original costumes used in the movies that he was in. The costumes and his memorabilia have traveled to the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. And soon this fall, the Chinatown Museum Society of America, CHSA Museum, will host his exhibit of Bruce Lee memorabilia. So look for it this fall. We're now here at Skyline Memorial Park in San Mateo, where many Chinese are buried, and we call it the Ritz-Carlton of cemeteries. Every spring, these Taoist priests and many families come by the busload to celebrate the spring festival called Qingming, which honors dead ancestors. Dick and I got a tour of the manicured premises with amazing vistas. And what a contrast that is to the 1800s, when Chinese could not be buried in the same cemeteries as other races, and they were pushed outside of San Francisco.
Kathy mentioned Kung Fu in regard to Bruce Lee, but another traditional martial art with a heritage from China, of course, is Tai Chi. And during the course of the book and the photo shoots, we learned from someone, I don't recall who tipped us off, that there is an annual International Tai Chi Day every year. So when we found that out, we talked with the Cultural Center, the Chinese Culture Center, and we all agreed we would offer free tea and pastries to anyone who would come take a Tai Chi lesson and then also perform some Tai Chi on the Kearny Street Bridge and allow us to take some photos of that. So here you see that group, or part of the group. There was some, in addition to this, doing some Tai Chi poses on the Kearny Street Bridge. Also during the course, we were very lucky to happen upon this woman. Her name is Xu Fen Xiao, and she is a Sifu, or what is known as, also known as a Tai Chi master. And she has many large trophies to show for it. And as you can see, her form is brilliant here. It turned out we found her because we were photographing her husband, who is an herbalist at his herbal shop. And then in the course of chatting with him, we discovered that Xu Fen was this master in Tai Chi. So we asked if she would be willing to come back and go around Chinatown and do some various Tai Chi poses in front of iconic buildings or murals, as in this case. So we have a plethora of great pictures of her doing all kinds of Tai Chi poses like this one.
We're here with the Tong family at Chinatown's Far East Cafe, which unfortunately has closed after 100 years on December 31st. But at every red egg and ginger party, it's given to a little baby who's 1 month old, and you have to have dyed red eggs to symbolize fertility, and a plate of ginger, which represents energy and strength. Another tradition, red envelopes. And it's the kids who love Chinese New Year the most. You typically give 2 red envelopes filled with 2 fresh bills to symbolize double happiness. Now, when a young lady grows up and gets engaged, the bride-to-be will traditionally order a custom-tailored cheongsam to wear for her wedding. Meanwhile, the wedding tea ceremony is a treasured tradition, but fewer and fewer Chinese couples are honoring it. However, Liana and Michael Tang are the exception. In this photo, you see the presenting tea to the grandparents, and in turn, the grandparents, and later on the parents, one couple at a time, will offer them money and jewelry as a blessing. Now, brides aren't the only ones who receive jewelry. Many times an older woman will start handing down her heirlooms to her granddaughter, her daughter, or daughter-in-law when she feels the time is right. In ancient times, people believed if you wore a 24-karat gold necklace or a jade bracelet, you would be protected from evil spirits. So Chinese jewelry is truly unique because it's not just something to wear that looks pretty. Many believe it possesses powers, and it's been used as money during times of war. This is one of my most favorite murals, which is unfortunately not up anymore, but it depicts everyday Chinatown life. Here, a modern woman passes a traditional trailer shop. She wears a traditional jade bracelet, probably given to her from her mother or grandmother. And she's carrying a bag of good luck oranges and a box of bakery treats that represents a sweet life. Now, this is my family sharing dim sum, otherwise known as going to yum cha, which is a common experience for many American-born Chinese like myself. So little plates of chicken feet and tripe and gizzards. They're not exotic to people like myself, but they're everyday dishes. So we would love for you to comment on what is your favorite dim sum in the chat box below.
Chinatown has a very strong sense of community, and you just feel that when you start to meet the people and talk to them about their neighborhood and their community. And the best way to get a sense for that is to walk through Portsmouth Square, which is the heart of Chinatown, also sometimes called the backyard of Chinatown. And when the weather is good, you'll see everybody sitting outside playing cards, playing checkers, playing mahjong, reading the paper, just chatting. The day I took this photo, that it was a very typical scene outside, and then the sky just opened up and it started to pour, and I assumed everybody was going to fold up their hand and stop the game, but that didn't happen at all. All of these women kept their hands. They unfurled their umbrellas, moved over under the protection of the gate that goes across the Kearny Street Bridge, and continued the game. And then once it got sunny again, they were back out in the sun in the park. Another sense of community is exhibited here. This is one of the family benevolent associations inside, obviously. This was on either a Saturday or Sunday morning, I don't recall which, when Kathy and I were allowed to go inside a couple of these benevolent associations and just see how people gather together from that association, playing cards, playing checkers, playing mahjong, reading the paper. and just chatting. And people will come even from the South Bay if they, or the East Bay, to come meet their friends there for the weekend, just to chat and renew acquaintances and stay connected. Another example of a strong community pride is the Miss Chinatown USA pageant. And it is a pageant for Miss Chinatown USA, not just San Francisco. And you might ask, why is there a separate Miss Chinatown pageant when you have all these other beauty pageants like Miss America and Miss California and so on? But in decades past and up until probably the 60s, the Chinese women were discouraged. Chinese women and girls were discouraged or prohibited from participating in these other events. So, of course, they did the next best thing and organized their own event. And even though that reason is no longer there, it's still a source of pride and an event that goes on annually. We were lucky to meet Miss Chinatown USA that year, a young woman named Catherine Wu, who's now a student at, I think it's biomedical engineering at Rice University. And here you see her talking and reading to some students in a bilingual school. So she would read in both English and Chinese and encourage them to be multilingual. We found out a bonus after we met her, that she is also a world-class athlete and archer, and was hoping to be at the Olympic Games, which of course unfortunately got canceled or postponed. But we did have her put on her USA uniform and bring out her very elaborate bow and tell us something about archery, and took some photos around San Francisco like this right on the bay. Now, in addition to the Miss Chinatown pageant, there are some other institutions that were formed because Chinese were discriminated against outside of Chinatown. This is the YMCA for Chinatown, and it was founded because Chinese from Chinatown were not welcome at other YMCAs around the city. So fortunately, they were supported by the national organization and able to create their own YMCA, which still provides a lot of services to the community. And another good example, Kathy mentioned being born in the Chinese hospital. And you might ask, why a hospital for such a relatively small community? But again, it was discrimination, inability to get access outside of Chinatown, and also inability to have access to some of the Chinese herbs and other medications and techniques. So now you have a very modern hospital. This is the donor wall. You can probably see it's in the shape of a dragon. And it's just a wonderful hospital there in Chinatown that serves the needs of that community.
Now, Chinatown is the densest neighborhood outside of Manhattan. It's only 1/5 of a square mile and houses up to 30,000 residents. So just imagine your home is the size of a closet and it's shared with 4 or more people. So welcome to single renter occupancy, or SRO apartments. So here, with no access to washers or dryers, you have to hand wash and hang your clothes outside to dry. There really is no choice. You share a restroom and kitchen with all your neighbors. Now, one of Chinatown's heroes is the Reverend Norman Fong, and he was the former executive director of the Chinatown Community Development Center. Now, on the day of this photo shoot, a young woman ran up to him and asked him to go visit her grandmother, who was very sick. She was too sick to walk down the stairs to go to see the doctor, because there are no elevators in these places. So very kindly and gently, he went to her room and he put his hands around her hands and whispered a prayer to her in Chinese. And Dick and I were very privileged to be able to watch that. Now, from the old to the very young, you have these teenagers who are part of the Dragon Boat racing team from the Community Development Center. And if you're with the CYC, all your gear, your practice time is free of charge. With this nonprofit, the sport's transforming the lives of at-risk kids, and they otherwise might be tempted to join the wrong crowd. Here's Bella Chen, who admits that she was completely unathletic before she joined the Dragon Boat team, and now she's the team captain. Today, many Chinese are proud of their Chinese heritage. Yuhan Chen, who's only 6 at the time of this photo, she picks up a brush for the first time at this Chinese New Year event, and she discovers that she excels at Chinese calligraphy. This is my nephew, Tyler Pham, and he's happily sampling dragon beard candy, making a beard of his own. Now, dragon beard was originally the dessert of ancient Chinese emperors, made from a solid block of syrup and pulled like taffy to form thousands of strands. These colorful buildings in Chinatown are not just ornamental. These belong to family associations, and there are more than 200 of them in Chinatown. Back in the 1800s, if you landed in Chinatown, you would look up your association based on your region or your last name. Now, the association would help you secure a job and a place to stay. These rooms today often feature shrines of ancestors. And I just want you to note that these are private clubhouses. They're not open to tourists or outsiders. So getting in to take pictures for a book was extremely rare. A play called King of the Yees about family associations came to Chinatown, to San Francisco 2 years ago. And the comedy was written by Lauren Yee, who grew up in San Francisco and went to many family association functions as a girl. These associations still exist, and the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association still exists with 50,000 members all over the US and in Canada. Recently, they worked with officials to block marijuana stores from coming into Chinatown. Now, the largest problem facing them is not so much outside, but within, because you can see many of these are elderly men and their sons are not interested in taking over leadership, and women are discouraged and blocked from taking leadership. This older woman is Cecilia Chang, who recently passed away at 100 years. She was a famous restaurateur and often referred to as the Julia Child of Chinese cooking. Back in 1968, she opened the very first elegant and successful Chinese restaurant called the Mandarin. It was based in Ghirardelli Square, not in Chinatown, because when she tried to get it inside Chinatown, they wouldn't let her. She was a woman, and also she didn't speak Cantonese. She spoke Mandarin. Her son Philip caught the restaurant bug later on, and he's the co-founder of P.F. Chang's with restaurants all over the world. This is Chinese school. And Chinese school began back in the 1800s when parents feared their children would lose their language and culture of the homeland. The youth at the time learned Cantonese for many years. That was the language of the Guangdong province where many Chinese were from. But today, kids are learning Mandarin, the national language of China.
I think, Kathy and Nicole, I'm noticing that we're about at the point where we'd planned to take Q&A. So I think what we should do is maybe just show you some of the other images and then wrap up with our narrated slideshow so that we can get to your Q&A, if that's okay with everyone. So Laura, who's running the slides, let me just tell you that in the book, you will find that there are stories and images about Chinese opera, which you see here, where I got to go backstage and take photos in the 3 hours leading up to it. There's a good story on the Grant Avenue Follies, which is a group of women in their 70s and 80s who used to be burlesque dancers, who still perform and do performances for nonprofits and are still remarkably agile and fit. So Kathy, maybe you could give an equally concise summary of the lion dancers and
Yes.
yeah.
So Laura, go ahead and roll along. This is Corey Chan, who's a lion head restorer, and he collects lion heads and repairs them. So you can see he's got this beautiful collection in his basement.
And restaurants, of course, Kathy mentioned Cecilia Chang, the very famous restaurateur, but there are many restaurants in Chinatown. Of course, you just can't get out of Chinatown without a stop at a dim sum restaurant or a bakery or another restaurant. There are some new emerging restaurants that are, I mentioned Mr. Jew's, which has a Michelin star. China Live is equal stature, equal quality. As you can see in that kitchen shop, beautiful, modern, contemporary kitchens, great cuisine, giant chocolate mousse bowls, as you see here. And this is Mr. Jew's. So when things come back in Chinatown, and this is a table at Mr. Jew's, by all means, plan to make a trip into Chinatown as these restaurants come back. This is Kathy Fang, one of the young restaurateurs who has a restaurant called Fang's, and she's won a number of awards.
And you can see here just in these coming slides that there's restaurants and delis, salted fish places, coffee crunch cake at Eastern Bakery, which is still open, and a number of wonderful places on Stockton Street where the locals shop, and Herbs where you make your own Chinese soup.
So the last section, I'm going to show you some of the business owners and entrepreneurs in Chinatown, in addition to the restaurants. And I'll go through this pretty quickly. So if you do have questions, please be sure and put them in a couple minutes. We will be answering your questions. Actually, you could go back. Yeah, just go back here. This woman deserves a minute. Her name is Tain Chen. She is 82 years old. She is the founder, owner, and operator of the Walk Shop on Grant Street. She's still working 6 or 7 days a week, 4 hours a day, handling online orders. She is a real dynamo, and you have to stop in the Walk Shop and meet her the next time you're in Chinatown. We tried to capture the essence of some of the businesses in Chinatown and to show the entrepreneurial spirit. So here you have an herbalist. This happens to be the husband of Xu Fan, the woman that I mentioned was a Tai Chi master. Here's a florist in Ross Alley, beautiful collection of flowers, and they do events for weddings, funerals, big events. A studio photographer who has photos of presidents, movie stars, governors that he has photographed throughout his studio. Acupuncturist, you see here. There are some businesses that cater especially to tourism, and of course now are being hit especially hard because there's virtually no tourism now, but gourmet tea shops, there's several of those, as you see here, jewelry and jade and other stone carving shops, as you see here. There are also some quite modern boutiques and shops coming in. This happens to be the gift shop at China Live. The woman is Cindy Chen. She is the co-owner of China Live with her husband, George Chen, who is the chef. And she has curated a collection from all over the world of cooking utensils, teapots, carvings, art objects, books that are just fabulous, especially emphasis, of course, on China, but from all over the world. And it's really a nice gift shop. And then another one is Kim Plus Ono, which is a new, very modern shop that sells hand-printed silk garments, as you see here, blouses, kimonos. The woman here happens to be dressed up for a crazy rich Asians night. That's why she's in somewhat untypical costume there. And then I think, yeah, this is the last photo. It's also the back cover of our book. And it is a mural that's painted in the back hall of a new restaurant called Dim Sum Corner. Very nice restaurant, by the way, open for takeout now on California and Grant. And this mural, we thought this really captures the essence of Chinatown today. You've got a young woman, looks quite contemporary with the graphic arts vibe in terms of the way it's done, with a modern camera, and yet she's wearing this very traditional red dress. So it's really an eye back to tradition and an eye forward to the future. And we thought that's a great representation for Chinatown today. So let us pause there and go to Nicole for some of the questions so that we can respond to your questions.
Thank you so much for that presentation. I feel like we always run out of time. There's so much more to get to. But I hope everyone enjoyed Dick and Kathy's presentation as much as I did. There are lots of questions about your collaboration. So people are curious to know how you met, how you decided to collaborate, what your process is like. What can you share?
Yeah, I think Kathy has the best answer to that.
Well, I wrote a story for the New York Times in 2018, and it ran and got everywhere. I had no idea the impact of the article because it was a story about Chinatown and how it was changing. Well, I got an email and I thought it was a spam. It was an email from the Chinese Culture Center saying that a man named Dick Evans was creating a book about Chinatown and asking whether or not I would like to collaborate on this. So I decided to just ignore that email because I had gotten some pretty dicey spams earlier, but I'm so glad I didn't. So I did contact the Chinese Culture Center. They arranged a meeting. We met together and decided that we were going to collaborate. And I really wanted to get behind the scenes stories of Chinatown. And Dick agreed because he really wanted to document the real Chinatown, not just what tourists see, but what's behind the scenes.
We've had some questions about how Chinatown is changing. Some of those questions have to do with COVID and how the community is responding, what the impact of the pandemic has been in such a dense area. You mentioned it's the denser than New York or the sort of densest neighborhood outside of New York. And then also, how is the will the neighborhood bounce back? Are young people living in Chinatown? What does the future hold?
Right. Well, there are a lot of questions there, so let me
Yes, sorry.
tackle
Combining a whole bunch.
Let me tackle a couple of those, and then I'm sure Kathy will have some good thoughts to add to that. First of all, Chinatown was hit economically before the rest of San Francisco was. A couple of months before the shutdowns and drop off, Chinatown was virtually abandoned because partly because of, I think, the president's attribution of being the Chinese flu, and the fact that there was fear that if you went to Chinatown, you would get COVID. So it was vacated a couple months before any of the city lockdowns went into place. So that also means that it's been affected longer than other parts of the city. And it has been really tough economically because, much of it was built on tourism, and tourism has just disappeared. Some businesses, like I mentioned, the Walk Shop in Tain Shan, because she had built up an online business a couple years before, is surviving. I'm sure she's not doing, especially, prospering, but at least she's able to operate, keep the lights on, and, has a loyal customer base, and undoubtedly will do fine when things come back. Others, Kathy mentioned the Far East restaurant that is shut down and probably closed forever, unfortunately. So it's been really tough. What Chinatown has going for it, I think, is the real estate is owned locally and by Chinese. They may not live in Chinatown, but their grandmother probably did, and they may live in the Richmond or somewhere. But so there is a community ownership, the broader community ownership of the real estate, and benevolent associations own a fair amount of real estate. And there has been 170 years in which they've prevented it being taken over and become condominiums, high-rise offices. So I have a suspicion that it's going to last beyond this, that it's going to outlast COVID. I think you'll see new businesses opening back up. Undoubtedly, there will be some that will close and not reopen, particularly those that have not been able to sustain any form of sort of online or pickup business during this period. But I think what I see in talking to the people since this has happened is there is still a real community spirit. And I think once there's a chance to reopen, you'll really see that come out and be promoted.
I also wanted to add an item about the population of Chinatown. It is mostly seniors. And one very telling bit is the fact that the Chinese hospital does not have a maternity ward. It does a lot of hip surgeries and cataract surgeries. So that's very telling.
But what I would add is beyond the physical Chinatown, there's a virtual Chinatown. And there are satellite Chinatowns like the Clement Street area and so on, where you have large populations of ethnically Chinese people and grocery stores and, other services catering to them. And many of them have roots and connections to Chinatown. And I think, just like Kathy, who left and now has come back, you've met other people that have, I think, are sort of relearning, reconnecting to Chinatown.
We have some questions about the history of Chinatown, and maybe Kathy, in your research, you came across some of it, but there's one question about how are the boundaries of Chinatown determined? And I imagine that has something to do with, well, I don't know. I'm sure there's a story there to be told. What languages are spoken in Chinatown today, and how has that changed over time? And someone asked about just more about the family benevolent associations. What can you tell us about those and how they sort of helped you figure it in migration stories?
Well, the benevolent associations were started during the gold rush because they were so necessary in establishing a place of security for new immigrants to come, to help them find jobs, to find lodging. They had, if you came to a benevolence, you would go to the one that's your village, your region, and they would ask you, who's your uncle, who's your cousin, and once they find out your lineage, they're there to help you. And they also settle disputes between neighboring villages too. So they also serve as kind of like a de facto court. And you find that there's a lot that has happened in Chinatown over the years. There was trafficking in the 1800s as well, with Chinese women and girls that were abducted and brought to San Francisco's Chinatown, when there was a period of time where prostitution was totally legal and women were sold. And so it's been through a lot of change and shifts. But again, the underscoring tagline is Chinatown is a place of resilience.
I think on the language point, just add it's predominantly Cantonese,
Mhm.
like 90%, probably 80%. And for some people, that is the sole language, actually. But there's a little bit of Mandarin creeping in now, and uh, and you're also seeing Mandarin now taught in the schools to the children.
Any information on how the boundaries or how
Oh,
Chinatown were
yeah,
determined and how it was situated where it is today?
yeah, yeah. My understanding is there was a desire on the part of the city to contain the Chinese immigrants. So they sort of, drew a circle around. Basically, the traditional boundaries are Bush Street on the south and Broadway on the north, and then Kearny Street on the east and Stockton Street. So there's only 3 blocks in the width, east to west. Now it does, I mean, it naturally creeps out a bit beyond that, but that's the traditional boundaries. It's 8 or 9 blocks long and 3 blocks wide. And that's the real concentrated area. It's also very interesting if you see an aerial shot of Chinatown. And I did go up on the roof of the Hilton on Kearny Street so I could get an aerial shot. And it's really fascinating because you can see the outline of the boundaries. Chinatown is like an island in a sea of high rises all around it. And it really is impressive that how it has been able to maintain those borders and maintain its character.
Also, at that time in the early 1800s, that where Chinatown is today, that was just a really undesirable neighborhood. And so Chinese just kind of picked up what was available to them, which was that area. It was totally undesirable with, shanties and, so people didn't really bother them. No one really wanted to go there. And so the Chinese went there.
Mm-hmm. Right. That's probably a similar story in other Chinatowns in other parts of the country. How about Chinatown today? Are there plans for a Lunar New Year celebration this year? We're not quite there, but it's about a month away. And then there was a question about walking tour. Anything that you recommend? This actually might be a nice time to do something like that.
You can do a walking tour. You can contact All About Chinatown Tours, and they are doing tours. Also, Walkwiz is still doing tours as well. So those are, I did the All About Chinatown, and Dick had gone on the Walkwiz tour and really found it fascinating. Right, Dick?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Maybe we can drop a link into the chat for one of those.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
so what do we know? What's happening around Lunar New Year this year?
The parade is definitely off, and I think indoor gatherings would be off. So I think there may be some virtual events and so on, but unfortunately, the things that we really love about Lunar New Year, the sound, the firecrackers, the music, the dancers, all of that, it will not be taking place.
Right.
Yeah. So it's really, really too bad.
Is that the first time in?
I think so,
memory?
actually. Yeah, I think so.
I heard that the television station, I think some TV stations were thinking about doing a summary, like highlights of the past Chinatown parades. So maybe something like that might happen, but I don't know at this time. But there are many stories about Chinatown on our website, and you just gave me an idea about doing a story on how you can do Chinese New Year at home. So maybe I'll put together an article about things you can buy and things you could do to celebrate at home.
That's a great idea, Kathy. And for the audience, if you want to read all of the stories that Kathy wrote, which are only 1 or 2 pages each with photos attached, but really insightful. I think there are 12 of them in the book, but there's at least that many, if not more, in addition on the website. So again, go to that ChinatownBookSF.com and click the tab that says stories. or click the tab if you want to read more about the history that is history of Chinatown, or click the photo tab if you want to see more photos, because there's much more on the website than there is in the book, of course, because we didn't have the physical constraints of page count on the website.
Okay. So let's see. Let me check my list of questions again. Oh, there was a question about the statue of the Comfort Women. So what were the 3 nationalities represented, and where is that statue?
It's in St. Mary's Square. If you look at that photo again, you'll see the building behind the statue is the Bank of America building.
Okay.
So it's just up the hill from the Bank of America building. It's St. Mary's Square by St. Mary's Church. It is right off of Grant Avenue. So you can't see it from Grant, but it's 100 yards off of Grant Avenue. And the 3 nationalities are Chinese, Filipina, and Korean. And each of those 3 girls represent that nationality in that sculpture.
You can tell by looking at their dress, and also the fact that Japan was really angry about it, and Osaka cut off its sister's relationship with San Francisco after it was erected. But I'm so glad Ed Lee did not budge.
Heard. Yeah, I heard that had happened. Okay, so, maybe a final question. We're curious to know how the people who were photographed in the book, how they responded to its publication. Are there any stories there? And then, Kathy, maybe a little bit about your research process.
Okay, maybe I can take the first one and then let Kathy wrap it up. The response was really good. When we photograph people, we sometimes would show them the mission book to give them an idea of what we were trying to create. Of course, we would only photograph them with their permission, or if we photographed them candidly, but then approached them and told them what we were doing and requested their permission. In a few cases, we went back afterwards when we knew we were going to use that photo and track them down. But of, I think, 150 people and organizations and photos where we sought permission, we had one person turn us down. And it turns out he was not Chinese. He was a muralist who was actually in the mission book and had given permission there. So I don't know what his issue was. Anyway, he turned us down. We had plenty of other material. Everybody else agreed. And we had promised everybody, if you're in the book, you will receive a free copy of the book when it comes out. So Kathy and I had the pleasure of going around and handing out some of these books to the people that are in the book. And it was just really heartwarming to see the reactions. They were thrilled in most cases. Some cases they wanted to buy additional books to give to their friends and family. But they were very pleased generally, and the support was just terrific. I found people to be exceptionally open once you gained their trust. And we tried to do that, of course, by making contacts. And we didn't just walk in cold on somebody and start taking pictures or interviewing them. We tried to make arrangements ahead of time. We tried to get introductions where we could. We explained what we were doing. And all of that, being partners with a trusted organization or with trusted people that made introductions for you made all the difference in the world. And as Kathy said, we were able to get into the inner sanctum of the benevolent associations and behind the scenes at the opera, and the back room for the acupuncturist and all that.
And for myself, in terms of the writing and the research process, I started with actually my own childhood. I just would make a list of all the things that I had experienced as a child, being second generation which means my parents were immigrants, and that meant researching dim sum houses and finding out about the Chinese New Year parade. I talked to a lot of Chinatown leaders who would introduce us to other people. When we wanted to go to the SROs, we asked Norman Fong, as you can see, to bring us there. Once we got to the SROs, he introduced us to the residents. So it was leaders, people who lived there, business people, and we would just ask for intro. Who do you know does this? Who do you know is Dragon Boats still happening? I would just be so curious about everything that we were able to get access. One thing was really hard though. We're trying to capture the traditions, and a lot of the traditions do not take place. Very few banquets take place anymore in Chinatown. And that was all I did on weekends growing up. There would be one wedding banquet after another. And a lot of you in the audience may have quite a few of these banquets that for babies or family associations or weddings. They're very few. And it turns out they've spread out into the suburbs to some of the large banquet halls that are now in the suburbs. Chinese red egg and ginger parties, they're celebrated at home. Chinese tea ceremonies for weddings. A lot of young people don't even do that. They go do destination weddings in Hawaii and Napa. So a lot of those things were really hard to get. So that a red egg and ginger party was precious. Getting the Leanna and Michael to do a wedding tea ceremony, actually I performed it for them. They didn't know how to do it and I offered it and they said, sure. And I said, well, can we have a photo? Can we have Dick, the photographer, come? And they said, yes. So that was the reason why they actually did it. So recreating some of these things was really fun. And it was such a pleasure to do this. And I, for myself, just learned to embrace my Chinese culture after so many years.
Well, I think we are all the beneficiaries of it. That reminds me, the last Red Egg and Ginger party I went to banquet was on Clement Street, so it was out in the avenue. Yeah.
We actually snuck a couple pictures in from Clement Street from their Moon Festival and so on, and more on the website too. Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you both. This has been fantastic. We appreciate the book and your willingness to join us tonight and talk about your experiences putting the book together. I want to thank all of our participants. I think at some point we had well over 200 people in attendance. So that's wonderful. For those of you who are still on the Zoom, we have a couple of events coming up that I want to plug, but I also want to mention that probably tomorrow we will do our little raffle for the 3 free copies. Those of you who called in, you won't, if you're the winner, you won't get an email. We'll probably call you to let you know. We have, let's see, we have 2 events coming up that I wanted to mention. We have an art talk with the Asian Art Museum on Silk Road. That's on January 21st at 7 p.m. Maybe somebody can pop the registration link in the chat. And then February 8th, we have another author talk. Susie Yang will be here to discuss her book, White Ivy. So once again, thank you both so much. Do you have any parting words before we say goodnight?
Okay, Fat Choi.
Just thank you for joining us. Yeah, it's terrific to have such a great turnout.
Yes, and we thank you for your willingness to bring this content, this programming to us, and congratulations on the publication of the book. It's truly beautiful. I hope you're all both very proud of it.
Very happy with it.
Thank you.
And you can find it in our library, of course, also. That's
right.
another place where you can find San Francisco Chinatown. Thank you, everybody.
Okay. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.